It must be 20 years since I joined Helen Garner in trying to revive the reputation of an Australian writer called Barbara Bayton. She was born just down the road from The Farm in Scone and finished up being very, very highly regarded in Europe, where her writings were often compared to the likes of, even Tolstoy. She married well, became a baroness, and was known as, in later life as the Baroness of Murrurundi. Now I'm going to try and help Joyce Morgan do the same for a woman called Elizabeth von Arnim, a best-selling novelist in the early 20th century, who married a Prussian count and then went on to marry Bertrand Russell's brother. She had an affair with H.G. Wells, was a frenemy of Virginia Woolf. Other males in her life were Forster, Somerset Maugham, and Elizabeth's cousin, Catherine Mansfield. What about that for literary thoroughbreds? And yet I'm guessing that just as most people still haven't heard of Barbara Bayton, you probably haven't heard of Elizabeth von Arnim either. Joyce Morgan became captivated by Elizabeth's little-known story and has written a beaut book called The Countess from Kirribilli. Joyce, you will recall as a former arts editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. Joyce, welcome.
Thank you, Philip. It's great to be with you.
I know how Bayton was forgotten, but how did this equally astonishing woman slip under the radar?
She was her own worst enemy. Elizabeth von Arnim never published under her own name. She published anonymously or simply as Elizabeth, no surname. She was also intensely private and mysterious, and she was prepared to lie about herself, even to her family, to protect herself. And then after her death in 1941, she fell out of favour. You know, it was the time of the angry young men, sort of not the time of satirical, witty, rather older women. So I think really it's only now that we are realising just how ahead of their time she was and just what a funny and observant woman and writer she became.
And of course there she was being advertised along with Kipling, Churchill and even Edith Wharton.
Yes, she was. You know, when her first books appeared, I was astonished when I found some early copies. And there were the advertisements for all these people running alongside her. And that continued throughout her writing life. When she wrote her last book, it had just been named as one of Time magazine's books of the year. And it was in the process of being turned into a Hollywood movie with Bette Davis. So her whole writing, 40 years of her writing life, she was right at the top of her game.
I understand that in recent years there was a hint of her prominence in, of all things, Downton Abbey.
Oh, yes, there was just a little tasty kind of morsel in Downton Abbey a few years ago when there was a character, I think he was the valet, and he gave someone a copy of a book. And, you know, this is Elizabeth von Arnim's, one of her books. And I think it was because of that time, the time of Downton Abbey, she was hugely successful. Everybody read her. Her books were reprinted and reprinted. So it was hugely, everybody would have known. You just said Elizabeth and everybody knew exactly who that was.
Now, let's go to Kirribilli, these days famous, perhaps even notorious, as the Sydney home of our beloved Prime Ministers. Tell us about Elizabeth and Kirribilli.
Well, Elizabeth was born in Kirribilli in 1866, not too far from where the Governor-General and the Prime Minister's residence are today. In fact, her uncle lived in what's now Admiralty House, the Governor-General's residence. So she grew up in this villa right on the waterfront. Her family were sort of newly wealthy. It was new wealth. She had a Tasmanian-born mother who'd had quite an impoverished childhood around Launceston. And her father was English, who'd come to Sydney as a young man, and he'd really prospered over 20 years in Sydney. So it was a prosperous childhood. She was the youngest of 6 children. But when she was an infant, her father decided he wanted to take the family to England on what was supposed to be a holiday, years-long holiday. But in fact, it turned out to be far more than a year-long holiday.
Before we go to England, let's just look across from Kirribilli to Sydney, because Kirribilli Point, Arcadian, native trees on the rocky foreshore. But Sydney, you describe as still being a refuge town, sewage still running straight into the harbour, where the Opera House is now. In fact, they've only recently stopped doing that.
Indeed. Yes, look, it was a raffish town. I mean, its convict background, it was still, not a distant memory. It was really unhealthy and disease-ridden. There was a lot of crime. So what her family looked across at into city and where her father had made his fortune was a pretty rough old town indeed. And I think that's why they moved across from the city to Kirribilli Point, because it was an escape from both the filth, the sewage, the raw sewage, the cholera, the disease that ran rife through Sydney at that point.
So they headed to Europe with all its social problems. But at the age of 3, she's the youngest in a family of 6. All the kids survived?
Yeah, they did all survive. She had 4 brothers and a sister, and they all survived. One went on to become a very prominent surgeon in England. They all did, the boys at least did very well. The other sister married and did not have any sort of career at all. But Elizabeth was always different, I think, right from the beginning, and I suspect she was probably her father's favourite. When I looked, her father wrote a lot of very witty journals himself. And when I looked through them, Elizabeth was the only one that he'd note down her little kind of witticisms and, the funny things this child said. And I know a lot of parents do that, but she was the only one of the 6 children that appeared to have much sense of wit. And
she also had some talent as a musician.
She was a very talented musician. In fact, she set out she played the organ and she studied at the Royal College of Music. So after she finished school, she took that very seriously. She was extremely accomplished. She had very good mentors, and she played organ. She played a number of other instruments. Her family always had pianos in the houses that they lived in. I think her mother sang as well. So there was a sort of performative and theatrical side to the family. But she was particularly good at music and loved music through her life. She was always particularly opera. She was very fond of Wagner, as it turned out. And her husband, too, was not only a good musician, as well as a Prussian count, but he was a friend of the Wagners, and he trained as a pianist under Franz Liszt.
Now, tell me about this German aristocrat, the good count from Prussia. There was a whirlwind romance?
There was a whirlwind romance when Elizabeth was in her early 20s and had shown virtually no signs of getting married. Her father took her off on a grand tour, and I think in his mind was to try and introduce her to a suitable man. And in fact, that's exactly what happened when they were in Rome. She met the Count von Arnim at a musical evening, and he very soon was pursuing her. And within a matter of weeks, the Count had proposed to her on top of the Duomo in Florence.
Now, I've got to interrupt you there and ask what language he proposed in. He didn't speak much English. She didn't speak much German. Of course, love is a language of its own.
Well, it is. They communicated in French. I suspect for the proposal, it's not clear what he spoke in, but it was a very clumsy proposal. She wrote about it years later, and it was more or less, it was more like a command than any romantic proposal, like "you will marry me" type of command.
So we
Anyway.
go from whirlwind romance to a whirlwind of fecundity, because she's almost immediately preggers and has 3 girls within 3 years.
Yes, she popped them out one after another. And she she was a tiny woman. She was only 5 foot tall. So she was pretty exhausted. And the first child she popped out, particularly, was delivered in Berlin, and she was refused pain relief because she was told by her male doctor and her husband that German mothers, it was, unpatriotic not to deliver, by easing their pain. So she found it absolutely agonizing. And she never forgot it when she eventually wrote a very frank account of marriage and motherhood. She produced probably one of the first unvarnished accounts of childbirth that I think I've read in the English language.
You mentioned in passing that she'd been tutored. Well, she was interested in tutors because she gets a succession of them for her daughters. One of them was a young fellow called E.M. Forster. The name rings a bell.
Yes, E.M. Forster came out to tutor her 3 little girls in Pomerania when he had only newly graduated from Cambridge, and he was just embarking on he was just beginning to write. He was writing his first novel, in fact, when he came out to tutor her 3 children. And he found Elizabeth very difficult to deal with. She sort of toyed with him. I mean, I think by then she was getting a little bit bored with the isolation in the Pomerania and the lack of intellectual stimulation. And I think she toyed with him, and she read his first novel, and she was like a cat playing with a mouse. She would say, "Oh yes, this chapter's great." Then she'd read a bit more, and she'd go, "Oh well, this is not so good," And she'd go back and forth. And of course, that was completely undermining to his self-confidence. So, to my mind, it's little wonder that he actually never really warmed to Elizabeth in over the years, even though he wrote an extremely funny account and broadcasted on the BBC about his time with Elizabeth and her family out in Germany.
I'm talking to Joyce Morgan about a fascinating Australian of whom we know so little. Now, let's move on. The Count Carxet. By now she's got 5 kids to support. She's written a few books, so she's doing okay financially. But before we leave the young tutors, 10 years or so after the Count died, there was one who might be described as a toy boy.
Yes, look, this was she'd been a widow then for some years, and she was in fact in her 50s when she embarked on a romance with another young Cambridge graduate who was 30 years younger than her. And she knew there was no future with him, but she spent most of the roaring 20s. In fact, they certainly did roar for Elizabeth. She spent it with this young, very handsome young man who spent most of the decade with. She introduced him to her literary world, her publishing world, and in the end, he became a very influential publisher himself. He headed Heinemann and was influential in fostering the careers of people like Graham Greene.
And of course, there was this energetic affair with H.G., which he describes as a bedbreaker.
Well, he certainly did, and he described it as very energetic. He wrote a kiss and tell account in which he, long after Elizabeth died, in which he described how they broke the beds of Europe several times. It's certainly it's disputed whether they had an affair. Elizabeth never said a word, although when I looked at her diaries, she certainly her friendship was with Wells for several years was very tempestuous. It certainly reads to me as though someone who likely had an affair. She was constantly either in tears or they were reconciling. They were traveling together around Europe. He was at her chalet in Switzerland, which she had moved to, and where he wrote one of his books as well. So it was a very, very tempestuous friendship for a couple of years. But H.G. Wells certainly left this monumentally indiscreet account that it was safely published long after Elizabeth was dead.
Joyce, it seems an appropriate time for me to ask you this. How good was she? I know she was compared to Jane Austen.
Look, I think her best books, they stand up really well, and they are very much ahead of their time in that the subjects that she's dealing with are even now quite controversial. Things like, an older woman with a relationship with a younger man. Well, we know what that was roughly based on. But also one of what, to my mind, is a masterpiece, which is a dark and gothic novel called Vera, is very much about a marriage unraveling and about a domestic tyrant who it's a classic case of what we'd call today coercive control. And that to me is like a masterpiece. And I think she recognized it as her best book. And that one was based on her disastrous second marriage, which was to Bertrand Russell's brother, his older brother. And
I love this. Talk about name dropping. This is wonderful. Now, in the UK, there was much speculation about the identity of this mysterious author. Was it a man or a woman, English or German? I love this. Punch said, and I sincerely apologise to our German listeners, no German is gifted with the particular type of humour that sprinkles over these pages. So she wasn't that anxious to have her writing translated into German.
No, not surprising, really. I mean, that's one of the reasons she didn't want her name on her books, because at least in the beginning, she didn't want to be identified as the woman who, as a Prussian countess, it wasn't done for her to be sullying her hands with commercial fiction, but also it would have identified her very clearly. And she became, she didn't like what she saw as a German militarism and chauvinism. And one of her books, she put a Prussian baron center stage in it, and This is
the Man of Wrath.
Her Man of Wrath was based on her husband. She wrote another one that wasn't so much based on her husband, but he was another Prussian baron. It was a book called The Caravanners, which had a very big fan in the form of Patrick White. He actually thought it was one of the funniest books, The Caravanners, that he'd ever read.
Now, of course, that she wasn't alone in having sometimes a masculine pseudonym. Henry Handel Richardson comes to mind with The Fortunes of Richard Marnie. It was not unusual for an Australian woman to do this.
No, it wasn't. She wrote that only under the name Elizabeth or anonymously once she had nothing on the cover. And another time she took another female name as Alice Cholmondeley. But I don't think she ever was concerned about whether she was being, some women who write under male names because they think perhaps it'll sell more. I don't think that was ever something that probably crossed her mind. So she, was content to be just simply known as Elizabeth. And that was who she really was, became the centre of a great literary mystery at the beginning of last century.
And our beloved Queen has adopted the name for her own. Anyway, tell me about her odd relationship with Virginia Woolf.
Oh, yes. Look, that was a peculiar relationship in as much as she's Elizabeth seemed to, not seemed to, she loved the writing of Virginia Woolf. She was a great admirer of her. And Virginia Woolf herself admired Elizabeth's writing. She once thought and wrote that she thought Elizabeth was one of the funniest writers she'd ever read, as good as Dickens, she thought. But like a lot of Elizabeth's friendships and relationships, there was a prickly element in it. And Elizabeth, under a pseudonym, and this was the only time she did write under a male name, was when she reviewed Virginia Woolf's Room of Her Own, I think it was. She reviewed one of Virginia Woolf's books, and she kind of savaged it. And it was a very chauvinistic review. And
forgive me interrupting you. I want to read just a bit of this. "Rooms don't make writers," she said. And as you point out, she was the owner of a 16-bedroom chalet with a separate writing retreat.
Yes, it was a bit rich when you read that. I mean, I was stunned and just open-mouthed when I read Elizabeth's review, which she wrote under the name of Oliver Way for that review. And I read it open-mouthed, and I knew from her private correspondence and diary, she actually admired this piece of writing. She thought it was pretty amazing. So I thought, why would you savage it? Why would you write so dismissively of it? And my theory is that she adopted this pontificating male persona to take the mickey out of the very sort of attitudes that Virginia Woolf was writing about in A Room of One's Own. So it's a puzzling piece of writing, and it's breathtaking in its chauvinism. But that's my theory of what happened there.
Now, as you point out, when war breaks out, life gets very difficult for an Anglo-German. She's living in Switzerland. She was able to get 2 teenage daughters out of Germany, and they fled across the channel, sleeping on the open deck of a boat. This is all pretty exciting. Was there also a concern about some Jewish ancestry?
There was. There was concern on that. During the Second World War, there was concern that a Jewish ancestor on her late husband's side, and going back to the 1700s, she had a daughter in Germany who was then married and was being asked to kind of root out her any ancestors who were Jewish, going back several hundred years. And Elizabeth was terrified this ancestor would be rooted out, and that her daughter, God, anything could have happened. Her big fear for her daughter always was that she could somehow end up in a concentration camp, and in fact, that is what happened to her daughter in Germany. Although it was after Elizabeth died, and it's unclear what happened, but she did spend 6 months in a concentration camp. Elizabeth feared that her own writing could could endanger her daughters, because although she was, she was writing in English, she was becoming, she was strongly anti-Nazi, both in her private statements and in things that she was writing publicly. So she did fear, nonetheless, that this could impact on her daughter.
Heavens above, we're just getting up ahead of steam and we're out of time, so we can't really deal with her marriage to Frank Russell, a married bloke, the older brother of Bert. But suffice to say that, as you point out, she's no saint. She goes to a pacifist meeting organised by Bertrand, but leaves in disgust. She found it such rot that I left. Bertrand, in turn, found her bellicose and unappealing. Well, I certainly don't agree with Bert on that. I find her absolutely fascinating, and thank you very, very much for effecting an introduction. I've been talking to Joyce Morgan, author of The Countess from Kirribilli. the mysterious and free-spirited literary sensation who beguiled the world. It's published by Allen and Unwin. Oh, Joyce's previous book, and I don't think we actually talked about this on air, but we should have, was about the artist and my old friend Martin Sharp. LNL on RN.